Imagine waking up to discover that hypersonic missiles, capable of obliterating an aircraft carrier in seconds, are now pointed at American warships from just 90 miles off the Florida coast. Not in some distant conflict zone, not in the South China Sea, right here, in our backyard, in waters the U.S. Navy has dominated unchallenged for over a century. This isn't a Hollywood thriller or a Cold War nightmare pulled from dusty history books. This is happening right now, in 2025, and the Pentagon is scrambling to respond. Russian military advisors have arrived in Venezuela with some of the most lethal anti-ship weapons ever designed, and the message is crystal clear. American naval supremacy in the Western Hemisphere is no longer guaranteed. The rules of the game have fundamentally changed, and Washington never saw it coming. The weapon systems that changed everything. Let's talk about the hardware that has U.S. Navy admirals losing sleep. We're not discussing outdated Soviet-era equipment gathering rust in storage facilities. Russia has deployed cutting-edge anti-ship missile systems to Venezuela, likely including the P-800 Onyx supersonic cruise missiles, and possibly even the hypersonic Zircon missiles that represent the bleeding edge of modern naval warfare technology. The P-800 Onyx is a monster of a weapon. Traveling at speeds exceeding Mach 2.5, this supersonic anti-ship missile carries a 300-kilogram warhead designed specifically to penetrate the armor of large surface combatants. Its active radar homing system can track moving targets at sea, and its low-altitude flight profile makes it incredibly difficult to detect and intercept. When fired in salvos, these missiles can overwhelm even the most sophisticated naval defense systems through sheer numbers and coordinated attack patterns. But if Russia has brought Zircon missiles to Venezuela, we're talking about an entirely different level of threat. The 3M-22 Zircon hypersonic cruise missile travels at speeds between Mach 8 and Mach 9. That's nearly 7,000 miles per hour. At those velocities, current American missile defense systems have virtually no chance of interception. The missile's plasma cloud at hypersonic speeds makes radar detection extremely challenging, and the time from detection to impact is measured in seconds, not minutes. A single Zircon strike could cripple or sink an American aircraft carrier, a vessel that costs over $13 billion and carries 5,000 personnel. These weapon systems are complemented by sophisticated radar installations, command and control infrastructure, and likely mobile launchers that can be repositioned to avoid detection. The Russian military presence in Venezuela now includes not just the missiles themselves, but an entire integrated air defense and anti-ship warfare network that extends Venezuela's defensive perimeter hundreds of miles into the Caribbean Sea. How America's own policy created this crisis. Here's the uncomfortable truth that Washington refuses to acknowledge. This situation is entirely of our own making. For more than 15 years, the United States has waged relentless economic warfare against Venezuela, implementing one of the most comprehensive sanctions regimes in modern history. We've frozen billions in Venezuelan assets, blocked the country from international financial systems, prevented Venezuela from selling its oil despite sitting on the world's largest proven reserves. And we've even confiscated Venezuelan-owned refining facilities on American soil. We've recognized opposition politicians who never won elections as Venezuela's legitimate president. We've funded regime change operations. We've organized attempted military coups. American officials have publicly declared that all options, including military options, remain on the table when discussing Venezuela. Every single tool of economic and diplomatic warfare, short of actual invasion, has been deployed against Caracas. And now we're shocked, genuinely publicly shocked, that Venezuela has invited Russian military protection. This is where we need brutal honesty about how international power actually works. Russia didn't force its way into Venezuela. Venezuela invited them in, And from Caracas's perspective, Russian missiles represent an insurance policy against American military intervention. When a country 90 miles from Florida feels so threatened by the United States that hosting Russian weapons seems necessary for survival, that tells us something profound about how our foreign policy is perceived globally. The strategic calculus has shifted dramatically. The deployment of advanced Russian missile systems in Venezuela fundamentally transforms the strategic environment for the U.S. Navy's Fourth Fleet, which oversees Caribbean and Latin American operations. Waters that American admirals have treated as uncontested territory for generations are now genuinely contested. Every ship operating within range of these weapons, and that range extends several hundred miles, is potentially at risk. Consider the tactical nightmare this creates. American aircraft carriers are massive, powerful platforms that project force through their air wings. But they're also enormous targets, and modern anti-ship missiles are specifically engineered to exploit their vulnerabilities. The carrier USS George Washington or USS Harry Truman, which regularly patrol these waters, now operate knowing that hypersonic weapons could be targeting them from Venezuelan soil. The nature of hypersonic missiles makes traditional naval defense strategies nearly obsolete. The Aegis combat system, America's most advanced naval defense platform, was designed to intercept subsonic and supersonic threats. Hypersonic missiles move so fast and maneuver so unpredictably that interception becomes exponentially more difficult. Even if a hypersonic missile is detected, the response time available to defensive systems is measured in single-digit seconds. A single Zircon strike could cripple or sink an American aircraft carrier, a vessel that costs over $13 billion and carries 5,000 personnel. These weapon systems are complemented by sophisticated radar installations, command and control infrastructure, and likely mobile launchers that can be repositioned to avoid detection. The Russian military presence in Venezuela now includes not just the missiles themselves, but an entire integrated air defense and anti-ship warfare network that extends Venezuela's defensive perimeter hundreds of miles into the Caribbean Sea. The historical parallel we're ignoring. There's an eerie historical echo here that should concern everyone: the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. That crisis, which brought humanity closer to nuclear annihilation than any event before or since, emerged from similar dynamics. The Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba not because of random aggression, but as a direct response to American missiles already positioned in Turkey aimed at Soviet territory. What we're witnessing now isn't identical to October 1962, but it rhymes with that history in deeply troubling ways. Russia is establishing a military presence in the Western Hemisphere specifically to counter what Moscow perceives as American encroachment in its own sphere of influence. NATO expansion to Russia's borders, missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, and American weapons now striking deep into Russian territory in the Ukraine conflict. The logic is symmetrical and brutally simple. If America can position military infrastructure on Russia's doorstep, Russia will do the same to America. This is great power competition in its rawest form, and the escalation potential is terrifying. All it takes is one miscalculation, one intelligence failure, one local commander making a split-second decision under pressure, and we could face a crisis that makes recent decades of relative peace look like a golden age we failed to appreciate. What the Pentagon knows, but won't say publicly. Behind closed doors, American military planners are confronting realities that contradict decades of assumptions about hemispheric dominance. The Monroe Doctrine, which proclaimed that European powers would not be tolerated interfering in the Americas, is effectively dead. Not because we officially abandoned it, but because we lack the ability to enforce it without risking conflicts we cannot win. Senior Pentagon officials understand that any military operation against Venezuela now carries exponentially higher risks. A naval blockade, which would have been relatively straightforward a decade ago, now means exposing American ships to weapons capable of sinking them. Airstrikes would require suppressing sophisticated Russian-provided air defenses. Any amphibious operation would face anti-ship missiles that could devastate transport vessels before troops ever reach the shore. The presence of Russian military advisors and potentially Russian personnel operating these weapon systems creates another nightmarish complication: the risk of directly engaging Russian forces. Any American military action that results in Russian casualties could rapidly escalate into a broader US-Russia confrontation. This isn't theoretical concern-mongering. This is the concrete reality that military strategists must now incorporate into every operational plan.
The broader pattern of American imperial overreach. Venezuela represents a microcosm of a much larger pattern. American attempts to maintain unipolar dominance are generating multipolar resistance. Russia isn't just in Venezuela. China has dramatically expanded its economic presence throughout Latin America, financing infrastructure projects, providing investment, and offering alternatives to Washington-dominated institutions. Iran has strengthened diplomatic and economic ties across the region. Turkey, India, and other middle powers increasingly maintain relationships with nations Washington has designated as pariahs. The entire architecture of American hemispheric control that we've taken for granted since World War II is fragmenting. It's fragmenting because the rest of the world has figured out there are alternatives to accepting American dictates about governance, economic systems, and international partnerships. Nations that face American pressure increasingly have options: Chinese investment, Russian military cooperation, alternative financial systems that bypass dollar-dominated networks. This is how empires overextend themselves throughout history. Dominant powers repeatedly make the identical mistake, believing they can maintain control through coercion rather than partnership, that they can impose their will indefinitely without facing organized resistance, that they can treat sovereign nations as subordinates rather than equals. And throughout history, this approach eventually fails. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, as the costs of dominance exceed the benefits, as resistance movements find powerful sponsors, as alternative power centers emerge offering other nations real choices. The human cost nobody wants to discuss. While policymakers debate military strategy and geopolitical positioning, there's a moral dimension that demands acknowledgement. Comprehensive sanctions don't primarily punish governments, they devastate ordinary people who have zero ability to influence their country's policies or international alignments. The Venezuelan people have suffered catastrophically under American sanctions. Access to food, medicine, and basic necessities has been severely compromised. The economic contraction Venezuela has experienced is worse than what America endured during the Great Depression. Millions have fled the country, creating a refugee crisis that has destabilized neighboring nations. All of this suffering has been inflicted supposedly in the name of promoting democracy and human rights, even though the actual effect has been to make ordinary Venezuelans poorer, sicker, and more desperate. There's something profoundly disturbing about a foreign policy that claims moral superiority while implementing measures that directly harm millions of innocent people. The Venezuelan government leadership remains in place, more entrenched than ever actually, because they can credibly point to external pressure as the source of economic hardship. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens bear the overwhelming burden of policies designed in Washington by people who will never experience their consequences. What this means for American security going forward. Let's assess what America has actually accomplished with its Venezuela policy. Have we achieved the democratic transition we claim to seek? No. Is the Venezuelan government weaker or more isolated? No. If anything, it's more secure because sanctions provide convenient scapegoats for economic problems. Are Venezuelan people better off? Absolutely not. Have we strengthened American influence in Latin America? No. We've demonstrated to the entire region that Washington is willing to wage economic warfare against governments it dislikes, making countries throughout the hemisphere more cautious about close alignment with the United States. And now we have the added complication of advanced Russian military infrastructure 90 miles from Florida. If there's ever a serious crisis between the United States and Russia, over Ukraine, over European security, over any number of potential flashpoints, we now have another theater of potential conflict.
another place where American and Russian interests directly oppose each other in close geographic proximity. This doesn't make America safer. It creates additional vulnerabilities and risks at precisely the moment when we should be reducing tensions. Every American ship that operates in Caribbean waters now does so knowing that sophisticated weapons are targeting them. Every military planner developing contingencies for the region must account for threats that didn't exist 5 years ago. Every dollar spent developing defenses against hypersonic missiles is a dollar not spent on genuine national priorities. The path forward that Washington won't consider. If I were advising policymakers, and I should note that nobody in positions of actual power seems interested in this kind of advice, here's what needs to happen. First, acknowledge that sanctions have comprehensively failed to achieve stated objectives while creating a humanitarian disaster and driving Venezuela into Russia's arms. Second, recognize that Venezuela, like every sovereign nation, has the right to govern itself according to its own preferences without requiring American approval. Third, begin serious diplomatic engagement without preconditions. The only way to reduce Russian influence in Venezuela is to give Venezuela a reason to distance itself from Russia. That means offering something beyond threats and economic warfare. Fourth, lift sanctions gradually in exchange for specific commitments on issues that actually matter to American security. Counter-narcotics cooperation, agreements about the military use of Venezuelan territory, mechanisms for protecting regional stability. But none of this will happen because American foreign policy is trapped in a paradigm that makes acknowledging failure or changing course nearly impossible. The bipartisan consensus in Washington holds that Venezuela policy has been correct, that any problems result from Venezuelan government stubbornness, and the solution is more pressure, more sanctions, more isolation. This consensus persists despite overwhelming evidence of failure. Despite Russian missiles now in the Caribbean as a direct result of this approach, despite the immense suffering of ordinary Venezuelans. The consensus endures because admitting error is perceived as weakness, because there are political costs to appearing soft on dictators or socialism, because the foreign policy establishment is deeply invested in a worldview where American power and preferences should be decisive. Until that changes, until we're willing to fundamentally rethink our approach to international relations, we'll keep creating situations exactly like this one. We'll keep pushing countries into competitors' arms. We'll keep expressing surprise when threats and sanctions don't produce desired outcomes. And we'll keep wondering why American influence is declining while refusing to examine how our own choices created the problems we claim to be solving. That's the real lesson of Russian missiles in Venezuela. Not that our enemies are irrational or the world inherently hostile to American interests, but that we've created many of our own problems through policies prioritizing the illusion of dominance over the reality of sustainable partnership. And until we learn that lesson, we'll keep paying the price for our own hubris.